Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for an in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, welcome your host, Jessica, with this podcast episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology podcast. Thank you for making us part of your week. Today's topic is big data in HR. And our guest today is the CEO of Moby Screener and good friend, Brian Wimpin. Brian also has two new books out. Two new books. One is called Note to Self and the other is Dancing with Data. I love that title, which is a book that I was privileged to contribute to. Brian, welcome to the Workology podcast.
Hey, Jess, thanks for having me.
Is there anything out of that, maybe short intro that you'd like to maybe add to?
No, probably the biggest thing is just say thank you for contributing one chapter. We also did another podcast called Thug Metrics, was the kind of the research engine to write the the big data book. And so, and as it relates to HR, and so your chapter was one of my favorites.
Awesome. Well, if there's one thing that I love is the topic of big data around human resources, because there are so many variations, opinions about this particular topic. So let's talk a little bit about big data. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about big data? What does this all mean?
Really, the genesis for even starting the research show before the book was written, all those things, was for me to figure out exactly what you just asked. What exactly is big data, specifically as it applies to the human resource function, the talent function, people function? And it was really interesting because, I really got an education, and as I discovered through conversations with all these experts throughout the country, kind of their take on it, which was pretty aligned relative to the definition of big data. And big data is really broken down to a definition that was consumable for me, was any amount of information or data that cannot be really crunched in an Excel spreadsheet. That's truly the definition of big data. So it's the large data sets that have become unwieldy. And to quote you, actually, from when we did our interview, is HR really is more small data and medium-sized data. They haven't really got to big data yet. So I subscribe to the fact that big data is really much larger than I've ever worked with. So I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like, because I haven't had my hands on it yet.
I think that's an interesting point of view, because, as you and I had been talking when we did the Thug Metrics interview, you're absolutely right. There's it's relatively small. Like when you're thinking about like maybe all the tweets on Twitter just today, that's big data in my mind. That's probably 100 million tweets. But the amount of information that you're gaining maybe in an ATS system, or the amount of interactions in your HRIS system, that's not 100 million pieces of data that are flowing around in a year.
Right, and that's exactly right. And you do bring up a good reference point for what big data could be, an external source for big data within HR. Maybe you're doing an exercise looking at brand alignment through like maybe your product marketing and your recruitment, and so through social. So maybe that external piece of data, Twitter or tweets, the conversation, the sentiment data that's going on about you, that might be some place to get your hands on a data set large enough that you could start looking at it with modeling or analysis that actually would qualify as big data.
What kind of impact does big data have on HR as a function or as a department for the organization?
I think actual big data could really be that one thing that's impactful enough to the business that HR could get changed pretty significantly. And I think it's really the same, and it's kind of the same conversation, or in my mind it is, that technology has started to really make HR into a different function, because you're able to access different parts of the business and tie it all together into something that looks more like strategy, for driving revenue and driving profit, right? So I think HR gets changed in the sense that you are going to have to want to be in HR, to want to go work your way up the ladder or progress in your career in HR. You are going to have to get more skilled in working with technology, and working with technology that involves doing analysis of more data. And I think that's the future. I think 5 years from now, the single biggest change of within the HR function is going to be the fact that you're going to have that data function within, within talent or within HR, and those people are going to be the ones that are probably going to be leading HR 10, 15 years from now, because they really understand something a lot more complicated, that you can't really fake your way through, so to speak. And that's not a ding on anybody in HR, but the fact is that you can kind of fake it till you make it, and you can learn as you go, which a lot of people do who get into recruiting, don't really know that much about HR. As a generalist, you get in, you learn, you get into management, you learn, and you start getting opportunities to be more strategic. And that's going to be a lot tougher when you have to have a certain level or technology, math acumen to crunch data. Long answer, but there you go.
No, and I think that's extremely important for us to think about as we're planning our own careers within the human resource function, and where can we go and what can we do to be able to add some additional tools to our career tool belt, so to speak.
Absolutely right.
Let's talk a little bit about technology around how you developed the book, because personally, I think this is brilliant how you did it and what you did. But let's talk about the podcast, Thug Metrics, and then how you went about putting together a book. But personally, I'm interested in this answer for myself.
Well, it was, first of all, I just want to say absolutely huge thanks to Monique Donahue, who's actually my publisher. She has been so unbelievably supportive with some of my craziness and my ideas, and has just been a great sounding board for that, and has done an amazing job. So first of all, get a great publisher. That's the one thing that I'll tell anybody that's my secret to writing: get a great publisher. But from a technology standpoint, so what I did, Thug Metrics for everybody, is just a research podcast that I wanted to learn more about big data with, not only within the HR function, but just in general. So I did 16 interviews over 6 months, or about 5 months. And it ranged from talking to HR tech leaders to, folks that were in recruiting, HR, different aspects or functions within the HR, practice. But I also talked to co-founder of one of the social analytics platforms. I talked to somebody, former research manager for Facebook. So that was the consumer side of things. And I started to see themes arising from all these conversations, which were 30 minutes that I would have and then replay, that I would kind of ask them kind of what was the future of big data? What was the impact? How can an HR generalist who really doesn't know that much about where, the big data function, where do they start learning about it? Where do they start, getting their hands on it, for their own business? And so, and from that, I started thinking, what, these are great conversations that collectively, individually and collectively, I think would be great for the HR generalist, the HR community, to be able to reference and re-listen, because these experts know what they're doing. They've lived in it a lot longer than a lot of us have, and have a great perspective, big and small picture perspective. So basically, I just decided and wanted to see if it was possible to aggregate those 15, it went from 16 to 15, 15 conversations into into a book that, really I didn't change a lot. Like I didn't wrap my perspective around every single chapter or break it down into the themes. I kept it pretty much into the original conversational form as much as I possibly could. And I just let the conversations kind of stand on their own. And so each chapter is an interview with one of the experts that I spoke with, a 30-minute interview. And I kind of set up the actual book with my perspective and kind of what my whole purpose was in having these interviews and sharing the book. And so and past that, it turned out to be a really enjoyable process that I hope a lot of people get some starting points, get some jumping off to maybe the next phase of they kind of got the basics down. What do they look at? Things to think about. Rabbit holes to avoid. Hopefully, there's some information that gives some people some value.
Well, the book is Dancing with Data, and
Dancing with Big Data.
Dancing with Big
That's right.
Data. I like Dancing with Data, but Big Data is better because it's bigger. And where is it available for purchase?
It is available currently on Amazon in paperback and Kindle form, but it's also will be available at barnesandnoble.com probably here in about 2 or 3 weeks. There's about a 3 or 4 week lag time between Barnes and Noble and Amazon as far as being available, but definitely available on Amazon and through the Sherm bookstore. Can't forget that.
So the book should be available by the time you're listening to this podcast now. I would say that it will be available on Barnes and Nobles online as well. Well, let's talk real fast about your other book, Notes to Self, and kind of walk us through what that's about.
Sure, that was definitely a personal project. It's a book about self-awareness based on my experience. It's from my perspective. I'm not telling anybody how to be more self-aware. I'm really just sharing kind of my journey on, kind of where I started, where I was at, where kind of my thoughts on where I want to go and how I manage my life. And things I've learned, and that is about it's Note to Self, a collection of 99 life lessons, of which I had 7 or 8 people, I think 8 people actually contribute one lesson, and then I wrote the rest of them. And it's really from it's really from first person, so it's I statements on everything. I'm not, it's not what you should do or anything like that. So, but it really just is about a journey. Which is interesting because there's the majority of my life for the last 20 years, well, all my life for the last 20 years has been in the HR field. So in some respects, so there's a lot of, HR people mentioned throughout the book and just experiences that I've had and different things. And so, I recommend it, for something that gets you thinking about other things, and personal, career-wise, there's lots of applications for it. So, or share it with somebody you think maybe would benefit from maybe being a little more introspective on self-awareness. That would be great.
We all could use a little bit more self-awareness.
Yes, we could. Yes, we could.
Well, let's take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is Big Data and HR with Brian Wimpen. You can follow Brian on Twitter. He's just at BryanWempen, Brian Wimpen. So let's go back to the big data topic and kind of redirect here. Let's talk a little bit about data. Who's in charge of it? So we're collecting all this information, this is data that's out there. We're maybe evaluating, analyzing the data. Who owns that data? Who's in charge of all that information, all those pieces that we're pulling from different places?
Yeah, what's interesting is there's definitely been some shifts because this used to be called, big data used to be called, business intelligence. That's one label it had. It's called data intelligence. and I tell the story over and over again, but I was using Cognos, which is multidimensional data management, back in the 90s, right? And so we were looking at, we were dealing with, at that time, what was our big data, like in 97, 98, 99. And so, it's been around a long time, but currently what the difference is that you have a lot of external data now that is more accessible, that you can mash up and you can start to look at, pose some questions and look for some correlations that you otherwise wouldn't have access to, just because a lot of that stuff was so siloed and so standalone. You really didn't have an opportunity to crunch data very easily or very efficiently at the very or quickly, to say the least. And so what's happening, I guess, within the HR function is the fact that it's being shifted. It used to be owned by IT, right? The technology part of the company used to basically own all the databases, warehouses. I mean, they owned all of that. So the governance really kind of sat under the CIO or CTO, as the case may be. And so that currently is kind of shifting into, you have multiple people that actually are over the data, because you're able to kind of compartmentalize or kind of parse out different elements of data and kind of lock that down in a secure way where people can add to it, work with it, analyze it. And so that part of it's getting much more sophisticated. Now there's a lot of solutions that are coming out that help with that. And so it's not as cut and dried as, a chief security officer or a CIO is really is really in charge of data governance. That's changing pretty rapidly. I could see in the next couple of years that you're going to have, somebody in HR is going to own data, somebody in ops is going to own data, somebody in marketing intelligence is going to own data. Financial data is going to be I think it's going to start to be segmented out. So it's not any one person that's going to oversee it. It's really going to be, within the kind of functions within the company. And so it's a big change. I don't think HR has really seen it yet, just because we're kind of on the forefront of all that. And so, again, it's going to come back to who has the capability within the HR function. And this is kind of a big company conversation that we're having, because big companies are already involved in this, and it's going to be within maybe the next couple of years, it's going to become a medium and then a smaller company conversation, because tools, capabilities will start to catch up. We're in kind of that lag. We're kind of in that lag time at the moment, or latency in the moment of HR kind of catching up.
And that normally is, in my experience, the case when it comes to some of these things. We are normally late adopters.
Sure.
Which isn't always a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing that we take that approach, but we're going to have to be moving faster and quicker and be more adaptive to change.
There's no doubt, because because everything is moving so quickly. I mean, HR was so resistant and so late to the party on the social side, but has started to, catch up a lot more because it's everywhere. And so I think this is a much more specific business-oriented example. It's not it's not like oh, that's nice to have. This is really a have to have. I mean, at some point, somebody else outside of HR is going to be owning data, telling them what to do. If HR doesn't really embrace, like, we need to own, the data side of what we do, and not be handed it over from somebody else because we just don't have the capability. That's a horrible reason not to kind of manage your own businesses, because you just don't have the capability, because you've chosen to kind of ignore it. So I really just hope that doesn't happen, and I hope there's the next generation of HR, and it might be the digital natives that take the lead on that. You just never know what that looks like, and so it'll be interesting.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about mobile assessment. I feel like mobile in itself, or assessment in itself, is taking, data points and research and information to help us make better decisions. So in many ways, it's exactly doing the job of what big data is supposed to be helping us do. But then you add in the mobile piece to it, and as the CEO of MobiScreener, you're living it. You're living in mobile and assessment. So let's talk a little bit about that, and maybe how it plays into big data, and then why mobile.
It's a great question. Everybody, literally everybody, will see the impact and the pivots and how quickly they happen around mobile. Prime example is that less than 2 months ago, Google changed its algorithm to, put the, basically to put the mobile sites or drive down on the search, the search results, anything that wasn't, mobile optimized, right, or had points around mobile. And so all of a sudden, guess what? I mean, the world is like mobile first, and anything that Google does as an aggregate, it's just is pretty much, the world's going to adapt. I mean, that's just the way it is, and they're being the search engine they are. But anyway, when it comes to the HR function, especially recruiting, which what we're focused on screening, basically screening and selection, so pre-hire, we see a huge gap in the fact that assessments are really not catching up with the market relative to mobile. So you've got a lot of the traditional assessments, and for everybody, we're talking about personality, just different types of screening and selection assessments, a lot of which are personality based. We saw a gap that, especially in the high volume hourly space, which we're focused on, there really wasn't a solution that can be completed on a smartphone. We're not talking about an iPad or a tablet. We're not talking about online. We're talking about actually doing it on a smartphone. And the problem is that they're old style questions. They're way too long to be sitting there trying to complete it on a smartphone. And so we're designing the first assessment that is really using some new and very current types of questions, styles, and we're also doing it less than 5 minutes. And so it's, we saw that, a 5-minute experience on a smartphone is very acceptable. But 10 minutes sitting on a smartphone trying to complete, so if you double that, the drop-off rates from what little information that we have in the marketplace is significantly more. It just is not an experience that people don't want to sit there for 10 minutes. But you'll have a lot of people. You got to figure the average music video on YouTube is almost 4 minutes, and so having an assessment that is not much longer than the average consumption time of a YouTube video, we feel pretty good about. It is a fairly nice experience for somebody completing an assessment in a hiring process.
We've done a number of podcast episodes here. We've talked about mobile apply, we've talked about mobile recruitment, text messaging, and mobile. But the mobile assessment piece, like mobile apply, it totally makes sense to me, because these people, the candidates that you're targeting in the high volume market, they are relying on their mobile devices in many cases as their only computer for themselves to be able to engage and do and live in their daily lives.
If you think about the fastest growing populations, which happen to be several of the protected classes, within EEOC Title VII, one of the fastest growing sectors is the Hispanic population, Hispanic Latino population. They are incredibly high, like mobile consumption, right? Anything that they do, I mean, it is like off the charts. And I'll have to verify, and double check what it is now. But within the last year, it's like 87% 80%, every 87% access different elements of what they do with their mobile phone, right? That's a high percentage in the highest growth population, workforce population, like within our hourly sector. If that's how they're consuming what they're doing and buying and what their experience is, if you do not have like your applying, your application process, whether it be one part of it like ours with the assessment or all of it, like soup to nuts, then you are potentially, in my opinion, you have the likelihood to create some adverse impact because you're not really going to be, offering a fair way to consume your process. Not to mention missing out. Oh my gosh, that's the biggest thing. You're missing out on talent. Forget fair. You're just missing out on an opportunity to get the best candidates in because you're eliminating a segment of the population. And so we love the space. It's nice. One of the reasons we've been working on the product for about a year. It's nice to be coming later to the technology party because we get to use the most current technology to build out our platform, which really excites me. We're not having to retrofit. This is a ground up build with the latest technology, and that's pretty exciting.
The time that it takes to watch a music video on YouTube, you can take a pre-hiring assessment. That's amazing.
That's the goal, and I think that stat's going to hold up for a while. So
somehow we need to make that into like a press release and add that into your marketing, because personally, I think that for me, everybody has time for a music video, and the drop-up rate is relatively low. So you can now you can find a great hire and get the information you need to make sure that they stick with you and are a good performer for your organization.
There we go. I love it. I'll press release that out right now.
Yeah.
I'm good about transcribing. So
I love it. Well, you're good about transcribing. That's funny. Brian, I want to thank you for joining us today. Is there anything that you wanted to add, or where can people go to connect with you?
Yeah, it's super easy to find me. Just you can obviously hit Google for Brian Wimpen, Bryan Wimpen. And Twitter's a good place, and you can always hit me through the website, Moby Screener, and that's Screener with NR at the end, no E. Very cool, hip type way to do it. Hit me anywhere there. I'd love to connect with anybody. So thank you for having me on, Jess.
Sure. And we'll link to Brian's company, Moby Screener, on the transcript. You can just go over to bloggingforjobs.com, go to the right-hand sidebar, and put in Brian Wimpen podcast, and you'll be connected. Although you might be able to find one of my favorite blog posts by Brian, where he talks about the job search, and it's a marathon and not a sprint. I don't know if you remember that post, Brian, but that's
I do.
From 6 years ago or something.
Yeah, I read it. I read it not very long ago because I wanted some inspiration in some of our actual editorial strategy for the future. So I literally read it in the last 30 days.
I love that post because it was one of our first to go crazy on Reddit or one of the other social bookmarking sites. It was just fun times, and a great blog post too. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and Brian for joining us and talking with us today. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, HR, and recruitment. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs to listen to all our past episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by Total Picture Media.